Charlotte Blackwell had been traveling for work, heading to a crucial business meeting that could make or break a major deal for her company. As she entered the airport terminal, she walked with quiet confidence, her first-class boarding pass securely in hand. It was early in the morning, the airport buzzing with the usual activity of business travelers and vacationers alike. But as Charlotte approached the security line, the eyes around her subtly shifted. There was no reason for it, not yet, but she could feel the weight of stares lingering on her. As she made her way through the crowd, the gate agent, a man in his late 30s with a neatly pressed suit and an air of routine authority, seemed to hesitate when he saw her. His eyes flickered over her casually, then quickly down to her boarding pass as she handed it over with a calm, measured gesture. He scanned it, his fingers tapping against the screen in what seemed like a little more haste than necessary, and then without a word, he motioned for her to step aside. Charlotte didn't flinch. She didn't argue or try to explain herself. She knew the drill by now. She was used to the subtle cues, the moments when she was treated as though she didn't belong when she was questioned, simply because she didn't look the way they expected someone with a first-class ticket to look. She was used to people like him, people who made assumptions based on appearances. In this moment, she knew it wasn't about who she was, but about how they saw her. The security officers who were called over didn't look at her as they approached. They simply followed orders. Two officers clad in dark blue uniforms walked with precision, their presence almost mechanical, a routine part of the system. One of them glanced at Charlotte, then at the gate agent, but said nothing. The other merely gestured for her to follow. Still, Charlotte said nothing. She simply obeyed, knowing that a confrontation would only give them more reason to escalate the situation. She moved as though she had nothing to prove, but everything to hold on to Ma. Step aside," one officer said, his voice firm but not harsh, the words seemingly empty, like a command issued without any actual thought behind it. They didn't need to ask if she belonged there. They had already decided. They had already made up their minds that she didn't fit the role they had imagined for someone in her seat. The fact that she was holding a first-class ticket, dressed in a simple, understated navy hoodie and jeans, didn't matter. What mattered was the assumption that someone like her couldn't possibly belong there. Charlotte let her gaze shift slightly, taking in the way people around her were reacting. The eyes of other passengers didn't protest. They simply confirmed what was happening. They were not shocked, nor did they make any attempt to step in. Their silence wasn't neutral. It was a subtle approval, a quiet confirmation of their own unspoken biases, but Charlotte didn't react to any of it. She was used to it by now. She had long since learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do in situations like this was to remain still, remain calm, and show that their assumptions were wrong, not with words, but with your actions. As Charlotte was quietly pulled from the queue, she simply stood there waiting. She could feel the tension in the air, but she didn't engage with it. She could feel the weight of their stares, but she didn't let it affect her. She knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about the way society chose to see her and many others like her. It wasn't her place to change their minds right now, but she could at least show them that their perception of her wasn't the full story. She showed them her boarding pass once again, not angrily, but with a quiet assertion. This wasn't about proving she belonged. It was about reminding them that they didn't get to decide who did Charlotte. Blackwell stood calmly in the airport terminal, watching the quiet flurry of activity around her. As the security agents continued their work, she didn't raise her voice, nor did she make a scene. Instead, she simply moved forward, her actions speaking louder than any words could. Her quiet presence felt like a subtle force of nature, one that was ignored by those around her, but would soon leave its mark in ways they couldn't anticipate. It was in these small, almost imperceptible moments that the true power she held began to reveal itself, not through confrontation, but through quiet resilience. The security officers looked at each other, exchanging glances as Charlotte passed them by. She had already shown them the boarding pass, and her calmness in the face of their unfair treatment did not sit well with them. They expected an outburst, perhaps even a challenge to their authority, but Charlotte gave them none of that. She didn't argue or raise her voice, nor did she allow her anger to show. She understood that their assumptions had already been made. No amount of shouting would change that. Instead, she did what she knew best. She moved forward one step at a time without looking back. There was power in her silence, a power that made those around her uncomfortable because they couldn't read it. They couldn't decipher why she wasn't reacting, why she wasn't challenging them. Charlotte wasn't the type to be loud or demanding in the face of mistreatment. Instead, she knew that sometimes the most profound statements were made in quiet moments. The more she walked through the terminal, the more it became clear that her presence alone was disrupting the natural order of things. Her composure, her calmness, was making others question the assumptions they had so casually placed on her. Her journey through the airport was marked by these moments of quiet defiance. Every time she passed a gate agent or another staff member, there was a moment of hesitation, an almost imperceptible pause before they continued with their work. It wasn't because they suddenly realized their mistake. It was because they sensed something in her presence that they couldn't place. They couldn't figure out what made her so different, what made her seem so unshakable. But Charlotte knew that this was part of the plan. By moving through the process without a word, without a fight, she was taking control in a way that no one had anticipated. As she passed through the security line, no one stopped her anymore. The moment they realized that she wasn't going to fight them, they didn't know how to react. They had expected a confrontation, a moment of resistance that would make them feel justified in their actions, but Charlotte gave them nothing. Her silence wasn't an invitation for them to continue their mistreatment. It was a quiet reminder that she didn't need to prove anything to them. She didn't need to raise her voice or escalate the situation. She simply needed to move forward, and by doing so she regained control of the situation without ever having to fight for it. Charlotte's true role in this situation, the significance of her presence, remained hidden to everyone around her. The gate agents and security personnel had no idea who she was. They didn't know that she was a critical player in one of the largest mergers in North America. They didn't know that the deal she was verifying had the potential to affect the very future of the airline industry. To them, Charlotte was just another passenger, someone who didn't look like she belonged in first class, someone who didn't fit the mold of the elite. They saw her as someone to be pushed aside, but what they failed to realize was that it was Charlotte who held the real power in this situation. Her role, her importance, was something they would never see, because they didn't know how to look beyond the surface. Charlotte understood this better than anyone. She knew that people were quick to judge based on appearances, to make assumptions about worth and belonging. She had faced this kind of treatment before, people treating her as less than what she was, simply because she didn't fit the image of what they thought she should be. But what they failed to realize was that their perceptions of her had no bearing on her true power. Her true power wasn't something that could be measured by a boarding pass or a uniform. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be seen on the surface. And in that moment, as she continued through the airport, without a word, that power was more evident than ever. In the end, Charlotte's quiet power was what would make all the difference. It was a power that was subtle, yet unyielding. It was a power that didn't need to shout or demand attention. As she moved through the airport unnoticed by most, she knew that the real change was happening quietly behind the scenes. And one day, the people who had dismissed her would realize that their own actions had set the stage for a much bigger story, one where she held the keys, not them. Charlotte Blackwell's journey through the airport was unfolding much as it always did, subtly marked by the small, unnoticed ways that people treated her differently. Every checkpoint she passed felt like another reminder of the world she lived in. As she approached the gate agent, she could feel the shift in the air. The agent's smile previously, a routine gesture given to every traveler, faltered ever so slightly when she saw Charlotte. It wasn't obvious, but Charlotte could feel it the moment the gate agent realized Charlotte didn't look like someone who belonged in first class. The subtle flicker of hesitation was there, though it was quickly masked behind the professionalism expected of airport staff. May I see your boarding pass?" the agent asked, with the same practiced tone they used for every passenger. Charlotte handed it over without hesitation, her gaze steady. The agent scanned the boarding pass, But this time Charlotte noticed how long the agent's eyes lingered on the screen. He didn't immediately hand it back, his fingers tapping rapidly as if checking something that wasn't quite right. A small furrow creased his brow just enough for Charlotte to pick up on it. She had been here before time and time again in airports around the world, and she had seen this behavior before, this subtle, almost unconscious bias that worked its way into the way people looked at her, spoke to her, and handled her. He handed the boarding pass back after a beat too long for comfort. "Thank you, Ma, he said. But it lacked warmth. It was a formal dismissal, but not one rooted in respect. She could feel his eyes still on her as she stepped forward, the invisible weight of judgment hanging in the air. Charlotte didn't react. She'd grown accustomed to this. She understood the unspoken rules, the invisible walls that certain people like her were meant to bump up against. She had learned that in these moments it wasn't about confronting the bias head-on. Instead, it was about moving through it, showing that nothing could shake her, no matter how small the slight. As she moved on to the TSA checkpoint, she noticed the same pattern emerging. The TSA agent's eyes flicked to her boarding pass, and then to her. There was no warmth, no polite acknowledgement, just a quick, almost clinical examination of her face. Charlotte could see the unspoken question in the agent's eyes. What is she doing here? Without a word, the agent waved her over for additional screening, as if it were routine. Charlotte complied without a change in her demeanor. She knew what was coming. It was never blatant, never direct. It was the subtle actions, the ones that felt like tests, to see if she would respond, if she would challenge the treatment. She didn't. She simply moved through the process, her presence alone serving as a quiet declaration that she wouldn't be treated any differently from anyone else. The TSA agent proceeded to search through her tote bag with a focus that seemed exaggerated. Her toiletries, a book and a folder, were sifted through each item inspected as if it might hold some hidden secret. When the agent's eyes landed on the sealed envelope, Charlotte's calm voice answered the unspoken question. Legal documents, she said, her tone even and composed. The agent glanced at her as if trying to decipher whether this was some sort of clever ruse. Charlotte's gaze never wavered. She had been through this before. She knew the game. The agent, after a brief hesitation, waved her through without another word. Charlotte offered nothing more than a brief nod and continued on, aware that her bag had been searched a little more thoroughly than the others, but unwilling to let it disturb her composure. As Charlotte finally made her way through the terminal, she could see the same pattern repeating itself. Passengers were treated with ease, their boarding passes scanned without hesitation, their bags passed through security with nothing more than a cursory glance, but every time Charlotte passed a checkpoint, whether it was at the gate or in the security line, she felt the eyes on her eyes that saw her not as she was, but as something unfamiliar, something that didn't belong. They didn't see her as a first-class traveler, as someone who had every right to be there. No, they saw her as a disruption, a person out of place. And she knew that they were all quietly waiting for her to do something, to make a scene, to prove them right. But she wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The truth was, Charlotte had learned long ago that this was part of the routine, the prejudice that came with being someone who didn't look like she belonged in certain spaces. She had experienced it countless times in airports, in offices, and in boardrooms. But it didn't faze her anymore. She had come to understand the subtle cues of this world, the way people like her were often treated differently, with less respect, more suspicion, and more scrutiny. And yet, she had also learned that this treatment was not something to be confronted with anger or frustration. It was something to be observed quietly and then moved past. She knew that the world had its biases, and she knew how to navigate them. It wasn't about challenging every injustice. It was about showing that no matter how they saw her, she would continue to move forward. By the time Charlotte reached her gate, she had already experienced the usual treatment, the questioning looks, the subtle bias, and the extra scrutiny, but nothing had shaken her. She stood at the gate, her posture, unyielding her presence, a quiet but powerful force that no one had quite figured out yet. They didn't know who she was or what she was truly here to do. But they were about to find out Charlotte didn't need to react to their treatment. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She simply needed to move forward, and in doing so, she would show them that their assumptions, their prejudice would never define her. Charlotte Blackwell's footsteps echoed softly through the bustling terminal, each step taking her closer to her destination, but her mind was focused elsewhere. The flight, the boarding process, the casual glances and moments of judgment, these were all distractions, small tests that would soon reveal something far bigger. To most people, this was simply another first-class passenger boarding a flight. But to Charlotte, this trip wasn't about a vacation or a business meeting. This was a calculated move, a step in a larger plan that could change the trajectory of an industry. She wasn't here as a traveler. She was here as the gatekeeper of a multi-billion-dollar decision, one that would reshape the future of the airline industry. In her canvas tote, she carried more than just travel essentials. Hidden within, it was the weight of a financial transfer document that had the potential to alter the course of one of the most significant airline mergers in North America. Charlotte's approval was the last piece of the puzzle without it. The merger couldn't move forward. The investment firms, the executives, the airline itself, all of them were waiting on her decision. But there was something more to this trip than the merger. Charlotte's purpose wasn't just to sign the papers and move on. She was here to witness something, to observe how the airline treated her, not as an executive, but as a woman who didn't conform to the image of a typical first-class passenger. She had been informed by her legal team that her approval was necessary before the next phase of the merger could begin. But it wasn't enough to just approve the deal from behind a desk. Charlotte knew that her decision could be influenced by the treatment she received, or rather by the lack of it. The law firm overseeing the deal had made an unusual request. Charlotte was to fly incognito. They wanted her to experience the airline firsthand, to see how the staff treated her as a regular passenger. How would she be treated when she didn't fit the image they expected? Would they assume she didn't belong, or would they welcome her as they did every other first-class traveler? Charlotte wasn't surprised by the way she was treated when she approached the priority check-in lane. The gate agent's quick judgment, the subtle hesitation, the slight but noticeable delay, all of it spoke volumes. To them, Charlotte didn't look like someone who should be in first class. She was dressed simply in a navy hoodie and jeans, no flashy accessories or designer luggage. She wasn't a walking advertisement for wealth or status. To them, she was just another woman in a crowded airport, someone they could easily dismiss as out of place. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that she controlled the future of the very airline they worked for. This trip was a test, a quiet observation of the very system she was about to shape. Charlotte wasn't interested in luxury or comfort. She wasn't here to enjoy the perks of first class. She wanted to see how the airline's staff would treat her when they didn't know who she was, when they didn't know she was the final authority in the biggest merger the airline industry had seen in years. She wasn't here as a VIP, nor did she want to be treated like one. She wanted to see what would happen when they thought she didn't fit the first-class mold. What would they do when she wasn't a woman in a tailored suit with designer luggage? What would happen when they assumed she wasn't a person of influence? As she moved through the terminal, Charlotte felt the familiar sting of judgment that came with being perceived as out of place. It wasn't overt, there were no harsh words or glaring looks, but it was there, just beneath the surface. It was in the hesitation of the gate agent when she handed over her boarding pass, the moment of pause that lasted just a bit longer than necessary. It was in the way the TSA agent glanced at her as though questioning whether she belonged in the line for expedited security. The subtle ways the world worked against her, she had seen them all before, but this time she wasn't reacting to them. She wasn't fighting back. She was observing, cataloguing every glance, every hesitation, every subtle act of bias. This was the real purpose of the trip. Charlotte wasn't just verifying a merger. She was gathering data on how she was treated by the airline. How would they treat someone who didn't fit the image of a first-class passenger? How would they treat someone who didn't conform to their expectations of wealth and status? As she sat at the gate watching the other passengers, Charlotte made mental notes. She saw how they were greeted, how they were treated with warmth and smiles, how they were ushered onto the plane without a second thought. And then she saw how she was treated quietly, scrutinized, questioned, and treated with suspicion. She was just another passenger to them, someone they couldn't place, someone they didn't know, and therefore someone they assumed didn't belong. Charlotte wasn't offended. She wasn't angry. She was methodical, calculating, and calm. She knew this was part of the test. This was part of the process. The airline had no idea who she was, no idea that they were about to be shaped by her decision. Charlotte S. role, her importance remained hidden from them. They didn't know that she held the power to influence the future of the airline, to decide whether the merger would go forward or not. All they saw was a woman who didn't fit the mold, and in that they underestimated her. They didn't realize that the very person they had treated with suspicion was the one who held the power to change everything. Charlotte Blackwell's journey into the plane was marked by a sense of calm resolve, but as she walked down the jet bridge toward her seat, she could already feel the subtle shift in atmosphere. Her first-class boarding pass was tightly gripped in her hand, but it was the looks and the small interactions with the crew that began to tell a different story. She had expected it, anticipated it. Even she was, after all, an unknown to them, a person who didn't look like she belonged in first class. She had anticipated the stares, the assumptions, the silent judgments, but this time she wasn't angry or upset. She wasn't here to fight them. She was here to observe, to quietly test the system that was about to shape the future of the airline industry. As Charlotte approached the first-class cabin, she felt the gaze of the flight attendants on her. It was subtle at first, a brief flicker of hesitation as they checked her boarding pass. The first flight attendant, a woman with sharp features and a practiced smile, barely glanced at her as she passed. There was no warm greeting, no smile, nothing to acknowledge her presence beyond the minimum. Charlotte had grown used to this type of treatment, but it never failed to strike her as odd the subtle ways people would exclude her, even though she held a valid ticket, even though she had earned her place in that seat. As she slid into the window seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't supposed to be here, at least not in their eyes. The flight attendants moved briskly up and down the aisles, serving drinks and snacks, speaking to passengers in rows ahead of her with a sense of purpose and familiarity. When one of them walked by Charlotte's row, there was a brief pause just long enough to show that she was aware of Charlotte's presence. The attendant's eyes met Charlotte's for a fraction of a second before quickly darting away as if she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge her as a fellow first-class passenger. The trolley with drinks and snacks rolled past her row, stopping for the others, but when it reached her seat, the attendant kept her eyes fixed firmly ahead and passed her by. Charlotte could see the other passengers, all of them enjoying the attention being offered beverages and small talk with the flight attendants, but Charlotte was ignored. Not a word was spoken to her. It was becoming increasingly clear that her seat in first class meant nothing to the flight staff. Her status, her ticket, her rights, none of it mattered to them. The same flight attendants who had been polite and efficient with everyone else were now deliberately bypassing her. When they came by with the meal cart, Charlotte noticed the same behavior. The attendant paused for a moment, scanning the passengers in her section before walking past Charlotte's row as though she weren't there. She served the man in the seat across from Charlotte, asking him if he'd like the meal option, offering him a warm smile. When she reached Charlotte's row, she stopped just long enough to offer an almost imperceptible look, something like a subtle signal, a silent message that Charlotte wasn't worth serving. Charlotte sat still, her expression neutral, her hands resting on her lap. She didn't react to the treatment, even though it stung. She was used to being treated this way, and today she had a greater purpose, one far more significant than this moment of mistreatment. She had the power to change the way this airline operated, but for now she would sit in the silence of their exclusion. She knew that by remaining still and unflinching, she was making a statement more powerful than any confrontation could provide. She wasn't here to shout, to fight, or to demand justice. She was here to quietly observe, to catalogue the way the system worked, and to test how far the airline S biases would go before they realized who she truly was. As the flight continued, the pattern of neglect became clearer. When the flight attendants passed through the aisle again, offering small items like blankets, water, and newspapers, they skipped Charlotte's seat once more. She was invisible, but they treated her as though she were an afterthought in a cabin full of people who had earned their place through wealth, appearance, or social status. Every time they passed her by, every time they ignored her, she saw the same pattern unfolding. They were testing her. They were seeing if she would react, if she would speak up. And with every missed offer of service, with every glance that was quickly averted, Charlotte learned more about the system she was observing. By the time the flight attendants returned to offer the post-meal drinks, Charlotte was ready. They passed her by again, but this time she spoke up. "I'd like a drink. Please," she said, in a voice that was calm but firm. The attendant, startled by the request, hesitated for a moment before offering a forced smile. "Of course, ma'am. What would you like?" The interaction felt awkward, strained, as if the attendant were begrudgingly serving her. Charlotte didn't engage with the discomfort, choosing instead to maintain her composure. She asked for water, received it without further issue, and then sat back in her seat, observing the flight attendants as they moved on to serve the other passengers with the usual warmth and attention. This was the moment Charlotte had been waiting for, the moment she would finally break the silence. Not by shouting, not by confronting the flight staff or causing a scene, but by quietly asking for what was rightfully hers. It wasn't about proving herself to the airline, to the crew, or to the passengers. It was about proving to herself that she didn't need to shout to be seen, that even in the quietest moments, her power was absolute. As the flight continued, Charlotte's gaze remained steady, her presence unshakable. The airline had no idea who they were dealing with, but they would learn soon enough. In the end, the treatment she had endured wasn't a reflection of her worth. It was a reflection of their inability to see beyond their assumptions, their biases, and their preconceived notions. And Charlotte would make sure that those biases would soon be exposed for what they truly were, a flaw in a system that thought it could silence her. As the plane ascended into the sky, the hum of the engine settled into a steady rhythm. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks, snacks, and small pleasantries to the passengers who had been carefully categorized by their place in the cabin hierarchy. First class was its own world, refined, efficient, and centered around service. But for Charlotte Blackwell, this world was already starting to feel like a performance one in which she was not invited to participate, even though she had a rightful place among the elite. Her seat was as legitimate as any other, yet the crew's behavior suggested otherwise. As the meal service began, Charlotte noticed the subtle shift in tone. The flight attendants passed by her seat again, skipping her without even a glance, offering meals, drinks, and care to the passengers in front of her. They had not missed her on purpose. No, it was much more deliberate than that. They simply ignored her. She sat still, observing their movements, her eyes scanning every detail of the flight crew's actions. There was no anger in her expression, no sign of protest or resistance. She understood what they were doing, testing her patience, pushing her to react to show that she was uncomfortable with the treatment she was receiving. But Charlotte wasn't here to make a scene. She had learned over the years that the true test of power wasn't about shouting or fighting back. It was about silence. It was about seeing how long they would continue to test her, how far they would go before they realized they had underestimated the woman they were ignoring. The flight attendants continued their rounds, offering services to the other passengers, but each time they reached Charlotte's row, they bypassed her, deliberately passing her by. It wasn't an oversight. It was a pattern, a carefully constructed exclusion. The woman sitting next to her, who had boarded the plane in a tailored suit and designer sunglasses, was given a warm greeting and offered a choice of beverages. A few rows ahead, a couple with a small child was offered extra blankets, an added layer of comfort, while Charlotte, the only passenger in her row, was left to sit quietly, her presence unacknowledged. No drinks, no warm towels, no questions. Not a word was exchanged with her. Not even a cursory, "Is there anything I can help you with?" It was as if she had become invisible to them, though she knew she was very much present. Charlotte didn't react. She simply sat there, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her expression as neutral as it had been when she first boarded. She could feel their eyes on her, but she made no move to engage with their silent tests. The power of this situation was not in confrontation, but in observation. She was watching them, cataloguing every glance, every deliberate oversight, every subtle shift in their behavior. In the world of first-class travel, where every detail of service was meticulously planned and executed, Charlotte knew that this was a game of control. They were trying to see if she would challenge them, if she would protest their treatment, and when she didn't, it made them uncomfortable. It made them question their own assumptions, but they couldn't admit it. Not yet, anyway. As the flight progressed, Charlotte noticed the small, almost imperceptible ways power dynamics played out in this confined space. The flight attendants, who had been serving the other passengers with warm smiles and attentive care, now seemed to operate on a different set of rules when they came to her row. They moved more briskly with less eye contact, as though avoiding her gaze altogether. When the drink cart finally arrived at her row, it was handled without a word or a glance. The attendant offered a polite smile, but it was thin, and she didn't wait for Charlotte to make a selection. Instead, she moved on quickly, leaving Charlotte with nothing more than the echo of her exclusion. Charlotte's silence became her strength. She didn't need to speak or raise her voice to make a statement. Her mere presence was enough. She could feel the tension growing, a quiet discomfort building in the flight attendants as they realized they were the ones who were being tested. But it wasn't just about her patience. It was about revealing the power structure that had been put in place, a structure that relied on certain passengers being treated better than others simply because of their appearance, their perceived status, or the way they conformed to the rules of the system. Charlotte was showing them that their system was fragile, built on assumptions and biases, and that when they failed to see her as someone who belonged, they were the ones who lost control. As the flight continued, Charlotte didn't change her demeanor. She didn't shout, didn't demand attention, didn't raise a single complaint. She simply sat quietly observing the way the system operated, and in doing so, she exposed its flaws. Every slight, every subtle form of neglect, every missed opportunity to acknowledge her, it all became part of the story she was silently constructing. The more they excluded her, the more they revealed about themselves. They were testing her patience, but what they didn't realize was that Charlotte's patience was not a weakness. It was a tool, a deliberate act of resistance that allowed her to see the truth of the system they had created. In the end, Charlotte knew that this wasn't about the small indignities she faced during the flight. It wasn't about being treated poorly or ignored. It was about the larger picture, the way power dynamics played out, when no one was watching, when the rules were unspoken, and when assumptions were made based on outward appearances. By remaining silent, by refusing to react to the exclusion she was facing, Charlotte was showing them that their behavior didn't define her. She wasn't here to conform to their expectations. She was here to expose the system for what it was, flawed, biased, and ready for change. And by the time she reached her destination, they would understand that their silence, their exclusion, had only revealed her strength. The flight had been cruising for several hours, the steady hum of the engines, a constant reminder that Charlotte Blackwell's journey was just beginning. The cabin, although elegant, was full of the usual noise, a low murmur of conversations, the rustle of newspapers, and the occasional clink of a drink being served. For most of the passengers in first class, this was a space of comfort and luxury, a place where they were treated with the utmost care. For Charlotte, however, it felt like an observation room. She was keenly aware of every detail around her, from the way the flight attendants moved through the aisles to the way other passengers were treated. Her seat, nestled in the quiet first-class cabin, was supposed to be a symbol of status, but for Charlotte, it had become a silent test, a test she hadn't expected to fail. As the flight attendants made their rounds, Charlotte felt their eyes on her, though they did everything in their power to make it look unintentional. Rachel, one of the flight attendants, passed by Charlotte S. Rowe several times, each time offering drink snacks and blankets to the other passengers, but never once glancing her way. When she reached the row across from Charlotte, she smiled politely, offered a drink, and engaged in light conversation with the couple sitting there. Charlotte watched as Rachel moved efficiently down the aisle, offering service after service to the others. Every time Rachel approached her row, however, she found a way to keep moving, avoiding even the briefest acknowledgement of Charlotte's presence. The neglect wasn't a mistake. Charlotte could feel it in the purposeful way Rachel moved past her. It wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, not by a long shot. She had experienced this kind of exclusion before, small, subtle acts of disrespect disguised as oversight. But this time, something inside Charlotte shifted. She wasn't going to let it slide. She wasn't angry, but she was determined to make sure the flight attendants understood that their behavior wasn't going unnoticed. When Rachel walked by again, this time with the drink cart, Charlotte spoke up, her voice calm but clear, cutting through the air like a quiet challenge. "Excuse me, could I have a drink, please?" she asked Rachel. Hesitated for a split second, her smile faltering just enough for Charlotte to notice. She could feel the shift in the air the moment when Rachel realized that Charlotte wasn't going to let herself be overlooked. For a brief moment, Rachel's eyes flickered toward her, but then she quickly looked away. "Sorry, Ma, Rachel said, her voice tight and almost apologetic. Complimentary drink service is only available to passengers in premium cabins. You're not in first class, so." The words trailed off as she tried to make the excuse seem more reasonable, but Charlotte saw through it immediately. The implication was clear. Charlotte didn't belong here, at least not in the way the airline expected. Someone in first class to Charlotte's expression remained unchanged. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. She had heard these kinds of excuses before, dressed up in polite words and professional tones. But this time something was different. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't going to let Rachel's dismissal go unnoticed either. "I am in seat 2A, Charlotte said calmly, showing her boarding pass without any emotion. "That as first class, isn't it?" Her voice wasn't demanding, just matter of fact. Rachel blinked, clearly caught off guard. For a moment she seemed unsure of how to respond. The subtle, unspoken rule that Charlotte wasn't the right type of first-class passenger had been broken, and Rachel knew it. Rachel recovered quickly, but the discomfort in her movements was undeniable. She leaned in closer still, unwilling to meet Charlotte's eyes. "I'll check on that for you." She muttered, a thin smile barely forming. Charlotte nodded, but her gaze never wavered from Rachel's face. She knew this wasn't an accident. She knew the behavior Rachel exhibited was deliberate part of an unspoken culture that treated passengers like Charlotte differently based on assumptions they had no right to make. Rachel quickly walked away, her actions speaking louder than words. She didn't return to offer Charlotte a drink, and by the time the cart had made its way back up the aisle, the flight attendant had moved on, offering drinks and snacks to everyone else, but once again ignoring Charlotte. The rest of the flight unfolded in much the same way. Charlotte sat quietly observing the pattern as it unfolded before her. Every time Rachel passed her seat, she ignored Charlotte, never making eye contact, never offering the same level of service she provided to the other passengers. It was clear to Charlotte now this was no accident. This was about her being marked as someone who didn't fit, someone who had no place in this first-class cabin, no matter what her ticket said. But Charlotte remained composed, her expression neutral, her actions deliberate. She didn't rise to the bait. She didn't shout, didn't demand to be treated like the other passengers. She knew that the more she remained silent, the more the power dynamic would shift. The less they saw her as a threat, the more it would expose the cracks in their behavior. As the flight continued, Charlotte's silence became her strongest weapon. She didn't let Rachel or any of the other flight attendants see her frustration. Instead, she observed them carefully, cataloguing their actions and their disregard for her presence. Each glance that was avoided, each drink that was passed by her, added another layer to the story she was quietly weaving. She wasn't just a passenger, she was an observer, cataloguing the moments of disrespect, the moments when people assumed they knew who she was and what she was worth. And in doing so, she was creating a narrative that would soon become impossible for them to ignore. By the time the flight landed, Charlotte had made up her mind. She had been subjected to this subtle form of disrespect for hours, and she knew exactly what needed to happen next. The airline had no idea who they were dealing with, but they would soon find out. The minutes stretched into hours as the plane cut through the sky, but Charlotte Blackwell remained unmoved, sitting in her seat. The world outside her window a blur of clouds and distant landscapes. Each minute brought with it a deeper sense of frustration, but she refused to let it show. The flight attendants continued their rounds, offering drinks, food, and small talk to everyone around her, but Charlotte remained invisible to them. Her seat in first class, which should have been a mark of privilege and respect, had instead become the seat of exclusion. She had become accustomed to being overlooked, her presence minimized, her importance dismissed. But this time it was different. This time she wasn't going to react. She wasn't going to allow them to bait her into an emotional response. She would let their actions speak for themselves. The man sitting across the aisle glanced at Charlotte's seat, a brief flicker of confusion crossing his face. His eyes moved over her once again, taking in her simple outfit, navy hoodie jeans, sneakers, and then shifted back to his phone. He muttered to his seatmate, clearly not thinking that Charlotte could hear him. "I don't understand why someone like that is sitting in first class," he said loud enough for her to catch every word. Charlotte didn't react, didn't flinch at the casual judgment. She had heard worse in the years she had navigated spaces like this, but what struck her most in this moment was the casualness of it. This wasn't an isolated comment. This was a reflection of the deeper unspoken bias that permeated the environment around her. She could feel it in the way the flight attendants moved past her, in the way the passengers around her were given comfort and care that she was denied. Rachel, one of the flight attendants, was walking down the aisle again, this time with the drink cart. She passed Charlotte S. Rowe, offering drinks to everyone else in her section, but once again, Charlotte was left out. Rachel made eye contact with the man across the aisle who had made his comment, and with a barely perceptible nod, she offered him a selection of drinks, engaging in a brief conversation. But when Rachel reached Charlotte S.'s seat, she stopped for a moment, her eyes flicking briefly to Charlotte S.'s face, then quickly moving away. Without a word, she continued down the aisle, skipping Charlotte entirely. The slight was becoming too obvious to ignore. It wasn't just the lack of service, it was the deliberate nature of it. Charlotte knew that Rachel had heard the comment from the man. She knew that Rachel had seen her, but still she chose to bypass her without any acknowledgement. It was clear now this wasn't just about the mistreatment of one passenger. This was part of a system, a culture of bias that ran deeper than the superficial politeness of customer service. Charlotte S. hands remained folded neatly in her lap, her face composed, not betraying any of the frustration she was feeling. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her upset. The more they ignored her, the more they tested her, the more they revealed about themselves. This wasn't about her. This was about the assumptions they held about people like her, people who didn't look the way they expected someone in first class to look. It was about the power they thought they had over her, the control they believed they could maintain as long as they treated her as if she didn't belong. But Charlotte knew better. She knew that their treatment of her wasn't a reflection of her worth. It was a reflection of their ignorance, their biases, and their inability to see beyond surface-level appearances. As the flight wore on, Charlotte S.'s resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't going to give in to their games. She wasn't going to react to their mistreatment. Instead, she would let their silent treatment reveal who they truly were. She would let their actions speak for them. By withholding kindness, by choosing to treat her as invisible, they were exposing their own biases for everyone to see. Charlotte knew that when they underestimated her, when they treated her like she didn't matter, they were making a critical mistake. They were giving her the power to shape the narrative, to show them the flaws in their system without ever having to raise her voice. The more they ignored her, the clearer it became that their treatment of her was deliberate. It wasn't just a mistake or oversight. It was a pattern, a system that had been designed to keep people like her in their place. Charlotte could feel the weight of it, but she refused to let it drag her down. She remained silent, calm and composed, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But in that silence, she was doing something more powerful than any outburst could accomplish. She was forcing them to confront the truth. They didn't want to see that their assumptions about her had no bearing on her worth. They could continue to exclude her, continue to pretend she didn't belong. But in the end, it would be their actions, not hers, that would speak the loudest. As the flight continued its course, Charlotte allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The silent test was nearly over. The flight attendants, the passengers, the crew, they had all played their parts. They had all revealed exactly who they were, and Charlotte was not the one who had to raise her voice to expose them. She had allowed their actions to do all the talking for her. The mistreatment, the exclusion, the subtle but deliberate ignoring of her presence, it had all been a reflection of their own insecurities, their own biases. And by not reacting, Charlotte had shown them that their behavior didn't define her. She wasn't here to be treated as they saw fit. She was here to reveal the cracks in their system, the flaws in their assumptions, and the power of silent resistance. Mid-flight, the cabin was quiet, the hum of the airplane's engines blending with the low murmurs of passengers as they settled into their comfort. Charlotte Blackwell, sitting in her seat, felt the subtle shift in the air as she noticed the lead cabin manager Thomas walking down the aisle. His movements were efficient, controlled, and purposeful, a reflection of his senior position. But as he approached her row, Charlotte felt a sense of inevitability wash over her. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when they would attempt to address her seat, to question her place in first class, to see if she would react to their continued mistreatment. It was a moment that they had orchestrated without knowing that she was already prepared. They didn't realize that they were about to push her into her final test, the one that would expose them for the biases they had so carefully concealed. Thomas stopped at Charlotte's seat, standing in front of her with a smile that was just a bit too forced. His eyes briefly flicked over her before he asked, "Ma, may I see your boarding pass? We've had a report of a seating issue." Charlotte's gaze remained steady. She had anticipated this moment. It was as if they were following a script, one she had already memorized. She didn't flinch or react to the tone of his voice, which carried the unspoken implication that perhaps she didn't belong where she was. Without hesitation, Charlotte reached into her bag and pulled out her boarding pass, holding it out for him. The calmness in her demeanor was almost palpable, as though she were in complete control of the situation, even as the power dynamics around her tried to shift. Thomas took the boarding pass from her, scanning it quickly, his fingers tapping across the screen with practiced speed. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the pass, his movements mechanical, like someone performing a task they had done countless times before. It was almost as if he expected her to challenge him to argue that her place in first class was legitimate, but Charlotte didn't. She simply sat there, her posture straight, her expression calm. There was no anger in her, no frustration. She didn't feel the need to explain herself to him. She had already proved in the quietest of ways that she didn't need to defend her place on the flight. Her silence was more powerful than any words could be. After a brief moment, Thomas handed the boarding pass back to her with a perfunctory nod. "Everything seems in order," he said, his tone now less certain, as if he were trying to convince himself more than Charlotte. He didn't apologize or offer any explanation for his inquiry. There was no acknowledgement of the fact that his actions were unnecessary, that he had questioned her simply because she didn't look like the kind of person who belonged in first class. But Charlotte didn't press him for any answers. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what had just transpired, another attempt to undermine her, another subtle test of her patience, and another reminder that the staff viewed her as someone who didn't fit. But she had passed the test with ease. Her calmness, her refusal to engage in their game of exclusion, had revealed more than any confrontation could. As Thomas walked away, Charlotte allowed herself a small internal sigh of relief, but the feeling was brief, quickly replaced by the ongoing awareness of the situation unfolding around her. The cabin crew's passive-aggressive behavior was continuing, though it was more subtle now. As the flight attendants passed by, they made deliberate efforts to ignore her. When they served the other passengers in first class, they offered smiles, small talk, and attentiveness. But when it was Charlotte's turn, they made sure to keep their interactions brief, even cold. A drink was handed to her without a word, a blanket offered with no eye contact, and every small gesture of hospitality was withheld. It wasn't as overt as a verbal confrontation, but it was clear that they were still treating her differently, still trying to maintain the control they thought they had over her. Their passive-aggressive actions were becoming more evident as the flight wore on. Each time Charlotte looked up, she could see the flight attendants exchanging glances, whispering to one another when they thought she wasn't looking. The subtle undercurrent of exclusion was there, running beneath the polished surface of the first-class experience. The staff had been trained to offer excellent service, but Charlotte wasn't receiving it, not in the way the other passengers were. She wasn't receiving the same warmth, the same attention, or even the same basic courtesies. The staff treated her as if she were invisible, as if her presence didn't matter, and though they never outright acknowledged it, Charlotte knew that it was their way of asserting power over her, reminding her that she didn't belong in this space. But Charlotte remained unmoved. She wasn't here to engage in their game. She wasn't here to demand apologies or recognition. She wasn't going to allow their biases to affect her. She had been tested throughout this flight, from the moment she stepped onto the plane, and she had passed each test with grace. By remaining silent, by not reacting to the mistreatment, she was making a statement louder than any words could. She was showing them that their actions, deliberate or not, didn't define her. She was the one in control, not them. And by the time the flight landed, they would understand that the quietest of tests often carried the most profound weight. As the plane began its descent, Charlotte remained in her seat, the only indication of her awareness being the subtle shift in her posture. Her mind was focused on the bigger picture, on the deal she was about to finalize, on the role she was playing in reshaping an industry, but she also understood that this moment was part of something larger, something that would expose the power dynamics that had been in place for far too long. The flight attendants might have believed they had the upper hand, but Charlotte knew that by the end of this journey they would realize they had been the ones being tested. Charlotte Blackwell sat quietly in her first-class seat, her eyes fixed on the passing clouds outside the window. The flight had entered its final hours, but Charlotte's mind wasn't focused on the horizon or the destination. Her thoughts were occupied by something else, something more important, something that had been building throughout the entire flight. The way she had been treated by the flight attendants, the subtle but clear dismissals, the ignored requests, the sidelong glances, she had catalogued every single instance of mistreatment in her mind. To an outsider, Charlotte appeared calm, composed, as though nothing could shake her. But inwardly her resolve was growing stronger as the realization of what had occurred became clearer. This wasn't just a series of small mistakes. This was a pattern, a reflection of something much deeper. Every action, every slight, no matter how small, had been noted. The way Rachel, the lead flight attendant, had ignored her on multiple occasions, bypassing her for services others were receiving without hesitation. The dismissive tone, the deliberate skipping over her requests, it had all been too obvious. But it wasn't just about the individual actions. It was about the fact that this kind of treatment was part of a much larger system, one that operated behind the scenes and went unnoticed by most. The subtle exclusion wasn't a mistake or an oversight. It was a form of control. They were testing her, seeing how much she would endure before she would react. But Charlotte wasn't interested in reacting in the way they expected. She was cataloguing their behavior not for the sake of anger or confrontation, but to understand the root of it. As the flight continued its course, Charlotte's thoughts began to crystallize. She wasn't just an individual passenger being mistreated. She was witnessing the manifestation of systemic bias, the kind that runs quietly in the background, hidden beneath the polished surface of customer service. It wasn't just about her being treated poorly. It was about the invisible rules that dictated who was worth serving and who was not. The assumptions that certain passengers, based on appearance, were entitled to better treatment, while others like Charlotte were simply overlooked. The way she had been treated wasn't personal, not really. It was part of the system they had set up, one that perpetuated inequality and reinforced biases without anyone ever truly questioning it. Her internal resolve grew stronger with each passing moment. She wasn't angry, though she had every right to be. The mistreatment was real, and it wasn't subtle anymore. It had become a reflection of how deeply ingrained the bias was in the Airline culture. But Charlotte wasn't going to let their actions dictate her emotional state. She had seen it all before, this slow drip of exclusion, the little ways the system worked to keep people like her in their place. She knew that their behavior wasn't an accident. It wasn't a coincidence. It was intentional, a manifestation of an invisible hierarchy that had been in place for years, built on assumptions and stereotypes that they never even thought to question. Charlotte was a woman who didn't fit the mold of a first-class passenger in their eyes, and so she was treated accordingly. But as her thoughts settled into this understanding, Charlotte also felt something shift within her. She was no longer just a victim of their bias. She was something more. She was a witness to it, an observer who was silently but powerfully cataloguing every moment, every exclusion, every slight. The truth was, they had no idea who they were dealing with. They had underestimated her at every turn, assuming that their mistreatment of her would either go unnoticed or provoke a reaction that would allow them to maintain control. But Charlotte wasn't giving them that satisfaction. She wasn't going to engage in their game. She would let their actions speak for themselves, and in doing so, she would reveal the underlying problem they hadn't even realized existed. In the depths of her mind, Charlotte understood that their behavior was isolated or random. It was part of a pattern that extended beyond the flight attendants on this plane. It was part of the larger system of inequality that existed everywhere at airports, in corporate boardrooms, in every space where assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't are silently reinforced. Charlotte wasn't just going to sit back and let it happen without a plan. She knew that the moment she walked off this plane, everything would change. The airline didn't know it yet, but their mistreatment of her had already set the stage for a much bigger shift. She had the power to expose the truth, to shine a light on the biases that had been allowed to fester unnoticed by those who didn't have to face them. The more Charlotte thought about it, the more she realized that the consequences of their actions would not be immediate. They wouldn't know right away that their treatment of her had been the catalyst for something larger. But that was the beauty of it. The consequences of their actions were invisible, quiet, like a ripple moving through the water unnoticed at first, but steadily growing in strength. Charlotte wasn't just documenting her mistreatment, she was preparing to hold them accountable for the system they had created. The final test wasn't about confronting them, directly demanding answers or apologies. It was about exposing the underlying bias they had built their operations on and making sure that when the time came, they couldn't ignore it anymore. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, the wheels skimming the tarmac as the engines gradually powered down. Charlotte Blackwell didn't immediately reach for her things or prepare to disembark like the rest of the passengers. She sat still, her gaze fixed on the window for a moment longer than necessary, letting the moment of arrival settle in. She had been through an entire flight where she had been subtly tested, where her place had been questioned, and where every small act of exclusion had been catalogued in her mind. But now it was her turn to shift the power dynamics. She wasn't here to be passive, to quietly endure mistreatment. She was here to expose the truth, to show everyone that the power they thought they held was only temporary, and that she, the woman they had ignored, was the one with the real authority. As the seatbelt light flickered off and the passengers began gathering their belongings, Charlotte stood slowly. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. The rest of the cabin was in disarray, with passengers reaching for their bags and chattering softly to one another. But Charlotte was unaffected by the rush around her. She had waited long enough, and now it was time for her presence to be felt. She glanced over at the flight attendants who were making their way toward the front of the cabin, eager to leave the plane. Rachel, the flight attendant who had repeatedly ignored her, caught her eye for a brief moment. There was no smile, no acknowledgement, just a quick, almost uncomfortable glance before Rachel turned away. But Charlotte didn't let the coldness bother her. She wasn't interested in petty exchanges anymore. She had a bigger task at hand. The moment the door to the aircraft was opened, Charlotte stepped into the jet bridge, her pace unchanging. She was met with the familiar sterile environment of the airport, the bright lights overhead and the hum of activity. But this time there was a noticeable shift in the air. As she made her way toward the terminal, a man in a dark suit approached her. He was an airport security officer, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He stopped just in front of her, and for a moment Charlotte could sense the tension. She could see in his eyes that he had been instructed to approach her, but what he didn't know was that Charlotte had anticipated this moment. He was no longer in control of the situation. She was. "Excuse me, Ma, I'm the officer," said his voice polite but firm. "We need to verify your identification before you exit the gate." Just a routine check. Charlotte didn't flinch, nor did she show any sign of concern. Instead, she looked at him calmly, her expression unwavering. "I understand," she replied evenly, "but I believe this one to be necessary. I'd like to speak with someone from the Airline internal team immediately." Her voice was steady, commanding the space around her. The officer hesitated clearly, taken aback by her request. "Ma, MIL need to escort you to a separate room for further clarification," he said clearly, not sure how to respond to her calm assertion of authority. Charlotte didn't move. She remained rooted to the spot. "No," she said, her tone clear and firm. "I am not going anywhere with you. If you want to speak with me, you will have to arrange a meeting with the Airline executives. I will not be dismissed, and I will not be treated as just another passenger. I have a critical role to play in the Airline future, and I intend to make sure you understand that—" The words hung in the air for a moment, as Charlotte's unshaken confidence settled over the situation like a silent command. The officer stood in front of her, visibly uncertain, his eyes scanning her face, clearly unsure of how to proceed. It wasn't fear that Charlotte felt, it was the quiet strength of someone who knew their worth, who had been underestimated for too long. She knew that this moment wasn't just about standing her ground, it was about making a statement. She wasn't going to be treated like a bystander anymore. The biases and assumptions they had shown her during the flight would no longer go unchallenged. She wasn't going to let the mistreatment go unnoticed. The officer finally relented, his posture shifting as he picked up his radio, speaking into it with a tone of uncertainty. Moments later, he stepped aside, motioning for Charlotte to follow him. She didn't move immediately. Instead, she stood there for a moment, watching as the officer called for assistance. It wasn't lost on her that had she been anyone else, she would have been treated differently. But now that they knew who she was, now that her power had been revealed, they couldn't ignore her anymore. This wasn't about her personal treatment. It was about the systemic failures she had witnessed. It was about the cultural biases that permeated every level of the airline, from the flight attendants to the gate agents all the way up to the executives. They had tried to treat her as though she didn't matter, but now they would see just how wrong they were. When the airline's internal team finally arrived, Charlotte knew that this was her moment. She didn't need to say much. Her presence, her authority was enough. She walked confidently into the meeting, her eyes meeting those of the executives who were now facing the very person they had underestimated. Charlotte didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout or make demands. The power in the room was shifting, and it was clear who held the cards now. The same airline staff who had passed her over, who had treated her as invisible, were now forced to recognize that their biases had led them to make a critical mistake. Charlotte, a role in the future of the airline, was a formality. It was a fact, one that no amount of exclusion could erase. As the meeting continued, Charlotte calmly outlined the future of the merger, her voice unwavering as she laid out the steps the airline needed to take to rectify the mistakes that had been made. The internal team, once dismissive of her presence, now listened attentively, aware that the decisions she made would shape the very future of their company. Charlotte's power was undeniable, and as she sat in the meeting room surrounded by those who had once disregarded her, she knew that this was only the beginning. The shift had happened, and now the consequences of their actions were about to unfold in ways they hadn't anticipated. The sterile hum of the airport terminal felt distant as Charlotte Blackwell walked through the doors into the room where the airline's internal team had gathered, waiting for her arrival. She wasn't nervous, nor did she feel the need to rush. She had already anticipated this moment. Every glance, every moment of hesitation had led to this confrontation, and now it was time to unveil the truth. She had spent the last several hours silently observing, cataloguing every instance of mistreatment, every moment the staff had tried to exclude her, to undermine her place in first class. But now, as she stepped into the room, everything would change. The power dynamics that had been at play for the entire flight were about to shift, and it would happen not through confrontation, but through the quiet revelation of her true role. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Charlotte entered. The executives, some of them visibly uneasy, others looking curiously at her, were seated around a polished conference table. They had no idea who she really was. Not yet, anyway. As they glanced up at her, there was a brief moment of discomfort, a recognition that something was amiss. Charlotte could feel the tension building, but she didn't let it affect her. She wasn't here to explain herself to them. She wasn't here to justify her place in the room or prove her worth. She already knew that their assumptions about her place in the world, had been completely wrong, and now it was time to make them realize that they had misjudged the situation entirely. Without a word, Charlotte reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder of legal documents. The airline executives watched her closely, their curiosity piqued. They had expected a confrontation, an angry passenger demanding an apology. What they didn't expect was for Charlotte to calmly open the folder and place several official documents on the table in front of them. The air in the room seemed to thicken as the first document came into view, its bold lettering unmistakable. It was a copy of the merger agreement, an agreement that Charlotte was the final signatory for. As she slid the papers across the table, her eyes never left the faces of the executives. They were trying to make sense of what they were seeing, the weight of the document sinking in slowly. Charlotte didn't need to say much. She let the documents speak for themselves. "I am the final signatory on this merger," she said, her voice calm and steady. "This $4 billion deal will reshape the airline industry, and my approval is the one thing that stands between your company's future and a deal that could change everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. The room grew even quieter as the executives leaned in, reading the documents in disbelief. Some of them exchanged quick glances, their faces shifting from confusion to realization. They had no idea that the woman they had dismissed, the woman they had chosen to ignore during the flight, was the very person whose decision would determine the fate of the merger. They had treated her as nothing more than another passenger, someone who didn't fit the mold of a first-class traveler. But now they were seeing the truth. The realization hit them all at once. The discomfort that had been creeping in slowly transformed into something else: embarrassment. The same flight attendants who had treated her as invisible, the same staff who had bypassed her at every opportunity, now understood the gravity of their mistake. Charlotte wasn't just any passenger. She wasn't someone to be dismissed or overlooked. She was the key to the future of their airline, the very person who held the final say in the $4 billion deal that would either elevate or dismantle everything they had worked for. And they had failed to recognize her, to treat her with the respect she deserved because of their own biases, assumptions, and blind spots. As the executives absorbed the information, their expressions shifted. The earlier tension in the room gave way to a wave of discomfort, some looking down at the documents, others glancing uneasily at Charlotte. One of the senior executives, a man in his mid-50s, cleared his throat and spoke up, his voice now much softer than it had been when she first walked in. "Ms. Blackwell, we had no idea," he said, his words laced with disbelief. I am sorry for the way you were treated on the flight. We didn't know who you were. This changes everything." His apology, though not directed at her personally, was a recognition of the systemic failure that had unfolded under their noses. The realization that they had treated her differently because of how she appeared, because of their own preconceptions, was hard for them to swallow. Charlotte didn't respond immediately. She let the weight of the moment sink in, letting them feel the full extent of the power shift that had just occurred. They had tried to treat her as invisible, to dismiss her as someone who didn't belong, but now she was holding the keys to their future. She wasn't interested in hearing empty apologies. What mattered now was the change that had to come, not just in how she was treated, but in the larger systemic biases that had been allowed to thrive unchecked. She had exposed them not by raising her voice or demanding attention, but by simply revealing her true role. The truth was there in front of them in black and white. They couldn't deny it anymore. The atmosphere in the room had changed, and Charlotte could see it in their eyes, the realization that they had misjudged everything. The executive who had spoken was no longer the confident, authoritative figure he had been earlier. Now he seemed small, his power diminished in the face of the truth Charlotte had just unveiled. She wasn't angry, nor was she seeking retribution. What she sought was acknowledgement of their mistake and a commitment to change. The airline had treated her like she didn't matter, but now they understood that they had been wrong. It wasn't just her decision about the merger that had power. It was the way they had treated her that was the real issue, and until that changed, the consequences would be felt throughout the company. Charlotte remained calm as the executives around her processed the moment. She didn't need to say much more. She had already made her point. The rest of the conversation would be about action, not words. And as she stood up to leave the room, she knew that this was just the beginning. The consequences of their actions were just beginning to unfold, and she would ensure that this moment, the moment they realized who she truly was, would change their perception of not just her, but of everyone who had been invisible to them before. Charlotte Blackwell's departure from the meeting with the airline executives was deliberate, measured, and unmistakably confident. She walked through the terminal with the weight of a decision on her shoulders, but a sense of quiet satisfaction settled within her. She had done what she came to do. The truth had been revealed, and now it was up to the airline to face the consequences. It wasn't about her victory. It was about the shift in the power dynamics she had orchestrated so effortlessly. Charlotte's quiet presence, her calmness in the face of mistreatment, had shaken the very foundation of how the airline operated. The staff, the executives, and the passengers who had witnessed the events, they all now understood that the woman they had disregarded was the one who held the real power. Within hours of her departure, the airline's corporate machinery began to turn in an entirely new direction. The ripple effect of Charlotte's silent resistance was felt across the company. The internal investigation into the actions of the flight attendants and ground crew was launched almost immediately. The executives who had once dismissed Charlotte were now scrambling to address the systemic issues she had so effortlessly exposed. What had started as an isolated incident, the mistreatment of one passenger, had evolved into a full-blown corporate crisis. The investigation delved into the attitudes and biases that had allowed the flight attendants to treat Charlotte with such disregard. The airline, once so sure of its unquestioned service model, was now being forced to look at the biases that had long been embedded in its culture. The investigation revealed the depth of the problem. Flight attendants, gate agents, and other staff had all exhibited signs of bias, some overt, others more subtle. The reports, carefully compiled, painted a clear picture of a company culture that had normalized exclusion. For years, the airline had operated with an unspoken hierarchy, one in which the staff, consciously or unconsciously, treated passengers differently based on their appearance, their perceived status, and even their gender. Charlotte had been a casualty of that system. She had been ignored, not because she was a first-class passenger who didn't deserve service, but because she didn't fit the image of what they thought someone in first class should look like. Her experience was not an isolated case, it was just the most visible example of a pattern that ran much deeper. As the investigation unfolded, the airline's leadership was forced to take action. Disciplinary measures were put in place against the crew members responsible for the mistreatment, though the damage to their reputations and careers had already been done. Rachel, the flight attendant who had so pointedly ignored Charlotte throughout the flight, was removed from first-class duties, while a more extensive retraining program on customer service and diversity was implemented for all airline staff. But the consequences went beyond the individual actions of the crew. Charlotte's experience exposed the need for a fundamental overhaul of the airline's corporate culture. They couldn't just remove a few employees from their positions and expect the problem to be solved. The issue ran much deeper than that, and it required a systemic response. As the weeks passed, the airline's leadership issued a public apology for their behavior. The CEO, once aloof and distant from the realities of frontline operations, held a press conference in which he acknowledged the systemic failures within the company. He spoke about the importance of creating an inclusive and respectful environment for all passengers, regardless of their appearance or background. It was a humbling moment for the airline, one that Charlotte had predicted but never sought out. She hadn't set out to destroy the airline, but she had made them confront their own biases. The airline was now under a microscope, and every aspect of their customer service model was being re-examined with a critical eye. They had learned the hard way that ignoring one person's worth, especially someone who had the power to influence billions of dollars, could have far-reaching consequences. For Charlotte, the apology wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much bigger. She had taken down an invisible system with nothing but her composure, her silence, and her understanding of power. The ripple effect of her actions didn't just affect the airline. It sent a message throughout the corporate world. Companies could no longer afford to ignore the biases that ran through their structures. They could no longer rely on assumptions about who mattered and who didn't. Charlotte had shown them that power wasn't just about status or wealth. It was about understanding the dynamics at play and using them to create real change. She had made them look in the mirror, and what they saw staring back at them was a reflection of everything they had allowed to happen in silence. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte continued with her work, overseeing the completion of the $4 billion merger she had been a part of. But the events that had unfolded in that airport, the ones she had quietly orchestrated, remained with her. They had exposed the biases and misconduct that were so deeply ingrained in the system. And though the airline had taken steps to address the issue, Charlotte knew that it wasn't enough. She had given them the opportunity to change, but true progress required more than a few internal investigations and retraining programs. It required a shift in how people saw themselves, how they saw others, and how they understood the dynamics of power. She had made them face that truth, and now they had no choice but to change. The ripple effect of Charlotte's quiet resistance had only just begun. The corporate world had taken notice, and the conversations about bias, discrimination, and power were happening in boardrooms across the globe. Charlotte had shown that change could start with a single moment of quiet defiance, that true power didn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it was the silence that spoke the loudest. It was a day like any other in the airline's corporate headquarters, but for the executives in the room, it felt like the calm before a storm. The recent internal investigation had brought their own actions and biases under a harsh spotlight. What had begun as an incident of subtle mistreatment, an overlooked passenger in first class, had snowballed into something far greater. Charlotte Blackwell, the woman they had so casually dismissed and excluded, had revealed herself as the key to their future. The gravity of their mistake was sinking in now as the full consequences of their actions became apparent. The executives who had once exuded confidence, who had thought they were untouchable, now found themselves sitting in the uncomfortable silence of their own guilt. They had targeted the wrong person. They had made a critical misstep, and the realization hit them like a ton of bricks. Charlotte's position as the final verifier for the merger had always been clear, but until now it had been a behind-the-scenes role, one that few outside the corporate circles had truly understood. But now, in light of recent events, it had taken on a new significance. Her role wasn't just a formality or a minor step in the process. Charlotte was the gatekeeper, the person who held the final say over a $4 billion deal that would reshape the airline industry. The executives who had once treated her with casual disrespect were now fully aware of just how vital her approval was. They realized too late that their dismissal of her wasn't just an oversight. It was a critical error. Charlotte's quiet power, her ability to remain composed and unshaken despite their mistreatment, had turned the tables. The full weight of her authority was now undeniable, and it was clear that this power, though quiet, was absolute. As the airline executives sat around the conference table, the room was filled with a heavy silence. They had all heard the reports of the investigation, read the findings, and seen the public apology that had been issued, but it wasn't just the formalities of the investigation that were weighing on them. It was the realization that they had misjudged everything. Charlotte wasn't just any passenger. She wasn't someone to be ignored or dismissed. She was the person who had the power to approve or deny the merger that would define the future of the company. They had thought they were dealing with an ordinary person, someone who didn't fit their preconceived image of a first-class passenger. But in reality, Charlotte had been in control all along. Her ability to stay silent, to allow them to expose their biases, had been the key to her power. And now they were the ones who had to face the consequences of their actions. The lessons learned from this experience were not just about Charlotte's importance in the corporate structure, they were about something deeper, something that would force the company to look at its own internal practices and biases. The executives were faced with the uncomfortable truth that they had allowed their own assumptions to dictate their treatment of Charlotte. They had made her invisible, assuming that she didn't belong in their world of first-class luxury, assuming that she was just another passenger who could be ignored. But the truth was, Charlotte had been the most important person in the room the entire time. The very biases they had relied on to maintain control had been exposed for what they were: flaws in a system that favored certain people and excluded others based on superficial judgments. Charlotte's quiet resistance had set in motion a series of events that would force the company to change. The airline was no longer in control of the narrative Charlotte had shown them that power could be subtle but also unyielding. She had used their underestimation of her to her advantage, and now they had no choice but to face the consequences. The company's leadership was forced to re-examine their practices, to take a long, hard look at how their biases had shaped their interactions with customers, employees, and partners. The changes that followed weren't just about making a public apology or issuing a few statements. They were about overhauling a corporate culture that had been built on exclusion and assumptions and replacing it with one that valued all individuals equally, regardless of appearance, status, or background. As the airline began to implement new policies and retraining programs, Charlotte remained in the background, her role unchanged. She wasn't looking for recognition. She wasn't interested in being praised for her actions. What mattered to her was that the company was finally confronting the systemic issues that had been allowed to fester for so long. The ripple effect of her actions had reached every corner of the airline, from the executives at the top to the flight attendants who had once treated her with such disregard. The lesson had been learned the hard way, that power, when held quietly and with resolve, could change the course of an entire company. And as Charlotte continued to oversee the merger, she knew that her work wasn't done yet. The real transformation would come not from the deal itself, but from the changes that followed, changes that would reverberate throughout the industry. Charlotte's role in the future of the airline was now secure. Her quiet power had proven to be far stronger than anyone had anticipated. The executives who had once thought of her as insignificant now recognized that it was not only her approval of the merger that mattered, but her presence in the room that had made all the difference. They had underestimated her, but in doing so they had inadvertently created the space for the change that was so desperately needed. The consequences of their actions were clear, and the lessons learned were not just about correcting one instance of mistreatment. They were about a fundamental shift in how the company viewed its employees, its customers, and its leadership. Charlotte had shown them that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from loud demands or forceful confrontations, but from quiet, steady resolve. If you found Charlotte's story inspiring and thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Inside HQ. We dive into the untold stories that reveal hidden power dynamics and explore the often overlooked truths in both corporate and everyday life. Join us as we continue to uncover the real lessons that shape our world. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest content and share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Together, let's explore the silent forces that influence our lives.